On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed while having his portrait painted at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. He died a few hours later.
This small southern community, which has been linked often with the name of the late President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is wrapped tonight in the deepest shrouds of mourning. News of the humanitarian president's passing, which came so suddenly here this afternoon, has brought sincere grief to the hearts of these Georgians.
Roosevelt had been coming to this tiny Georgia town for years. The warm mineral springs were therapeutic for his lasting symptoms from polio.
So when FDR was here for his first swim, it was just 3 days after Jimmy Carter was born. So you have two future presidents in Georgia at the same time.
About 70 miles south of Warm Springs is Plains, Georgia, the home of President Jimmy Carter.
Meet your next governor, Jimmy Carter, a Georgian by heritage and by choice. The Carters have lived and farmed in Sumter County since 1840.
Both sites have shaped history and continue to inspire leaders today.
I know this country. I know our people. And I know we can unite and heal this nation. Warm Springs is a good place to talk about hope and healing.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas. On this July 4th holiday weekend, we're going on a Georgia presidential politics road trip. This is an encore of an episode we first aired in 2024. So slather up the sunscreen and stuff your WABE tote bag with some snacks for the road.
Chex Mix was the first one that came to my mind.
Beef jerky. Always take beef jerky anywhere I go.
For this special episode of Plugged In from WABE. Imagine we're heading south from Atlanta on I-85 to two tiny towns where we find our next guests. Jason Grantham manages Roosevelt's Little White House State Historic Site in Warm Springs, Georgia, and Jennifer Hopkins is the lead education ranger at Jimmy Carter National Historical Park in Plains. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to dig in a bit more to each of your sites. Let's go back in time and start with the Little White House in Warm Springs. Jason, for our radio listeners, can you paint me a picture of this place and maybe situate me in the time period that Roosevelt was spending time in Warm Springs?
So the Little White House is just as it was in 1945. So FDR began visiting Warm Springs in 1924. And visited 41 times altogether between 1924 and 1945 when he passed away there at the Little White House. Everything, like I said, is just like it was when he passed away. So all the dishes, linens, furnishings were all original, belonged there, and him and his staff and guests used them. So it's like walking into a time capsule.
So how did FDR end up with a home in rural South Georgia in the first place? He is not from here. He's from New York. How did he end up here in our state?
So there was a gentleman named George Foster Peabody that was owner of the Meriwether Inn, and he was an acquaintance of FDR's, and there was a young man that had swam his way to health in the pools after doing some exercises, and George Foster Peabody knew that FDR had tried everything in the world to cure his polio and was unsuccessful, so he told him to try this as a last resort. Well, it didn't cure FDR's polio, obviously, but he fell in love with the place and the people and ended up buying the Meriwether Inn and turning it into the world's first polio treatment center and built a little home here on the side of the mountain.
So for our radio listeners who maybe haven't been to Warm Springs, can't look at a picture right now of this place, describe what it looks like when you walk up the path from the visitor center and you approach what's called the Little White House.
Situated in the country, away from any other homes. It's very quiet and peaceful. It's a little white clapboard cottage with two outbuildings, a servant's quarters and a guest house, several secret service posts. There's some big lights that would light up the place if there were any attacks on the president.
Talk to me about how this place, how Warm Springs, how South Georgia shaped FDR and his presidency.
Well, when FDR came to Georgia, he was, for lack of a better term, a spoiled brat. He was from wealth and didn't understand struggle too much. And he would ride around and see the people here in Warm Springs working from sun up to sundown, couldn't afford electricity, were losing their homes, were losing their farms. By riding around the countryside here and meeting those people and seeing their struggles, he created some ideas in his head on how to make things better. And in 1933, after the inauguration, he started putting those into place, part of what's called the New Deal programs.
I want to ask you about the moment that this place has really become known for. It's where FDR died in 1945. And, one of the things that struck me when I visited was how, like you said, almost nothing in the house has been touched or moved since that day. I mean, down to the original roll of toilet paper in the bathroom. Can you describe this moment when FDR passed and why it's so significant in the sweep of presidential history and in the history of Georgia and Warm Springs?
FDR was sitting for a portrait on April 12, 1945, an artist named Elizabeth Shumatoff. He was getting ready for a barbecue. He's working on Jefferson Day speech and United Nations legislation. He collapsed.
From his beloved second home at Warm Springs, Georgia, the body of Franklin Delano Roosevelt moves on the first stages of its journey to his final resting place. Scores of sufferers from infantile paralysis sorrowfully bid farewell to their great friend and benefactor.
That moment in history kind of shocked the entire world. Our nation grieved like they've never grieved for a president before or after.
And all along the 700-mile route, people gather to honor President Roosevelt and his ideals.
The portrait, unfinished, hangs in our legacy exhibit. It was donated to the site by the artist in 1952.
I want to turn to Jennifer in Plains. Let's transport our listeners to the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. Jennifer, can you just describe what it's like to be in this space, in this town?
Yeah, the town itself has a very unique personality. It is the location of the 1976 presidential campaign headquarters and the 1980 presidential campaign headquarters. And so the town itself is sort of cemented in that time period. We still even have the historic depot, the train depot that President Carter ran his campaign out of.
Jimmy Carter knows what it's like to work for a living. Until he became governor, he put in 12 hours a day in his shirt sleeves during harvest at his farm.
We also manage Plains High School, which is the state school of Georgia. It looks like your typical school that would have been around in the 1930s and 40s. Several of our visitors walk in the doors and they feel like they're walking back into their own elementary and middle schools. And then we also manage the historic boyhood home where Jimmy Carter grew up from the time that he was 4 years old all the way until he graduated high school at 17. And the farm is set specifically in the year 1937. So you're seeing a rural tenant farming farm without electricity and sort of seeing that transition from outhouses to indoor plumbing and right before the Rural Electrification Act comes into play. So you get to see several different time periods in your visit here.
So let's stick with that time period a little bit. When Carter's growing up, what was happening in Georgia politics and in national politics?
Well, the 1930s, as we know, is a very interesting time because we were going through the Great Depression. Not only is the United States struggling economically, but it's a depression that's affecting the entire world. And so here in rural South Georgia, there are several New Deal programs that affect the Carters. One of them was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The New Deal program, that program specifically, is how Carter got his first job. He's going to local farms and surveying these farms and reporting his findings back to the federal government. And again, with the Rural Electrification Act, I'm trying to bring electricity down to these more southern parts of the state.
In 1935, REA is born. 90% of all American farms without light or power. The cities are lighted, the country still in the dark.
His father, Earl Carter, has a commissary store here on site. One of the caveats of that act is that there has to be a local business that needs power. And so that's how the farm ends up getting power. So the resourcefulness that Jimmy Carter's growing up with in this Depression era really influences his policies later as governor of Georgia and even president of the United States. The renewable resources that he's looking for, he has a windmill here on the farm, and that's what's providing indoor plumbing for them. And so as president, we see him trying to locate, solar energy, wind energy, because he's thinking back to his farm days. He's also thinking back to who he worked alongside here at the farm. The Carters practiced tenant farming. In fact, I'm inside a tenant farmer's house at this moment recording this podcast. And so he was worked alongside African Americans, and he knows their capabilities. And so when he becomes governor and president of the United States, he has one of the most diverse cabinets of any president up to that time period. And I think, again, that all stems from his childhood upbringing here.
Something that's really unique about the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park and Plains is that it's really a living, breathing place. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter continue to live here for decades. Jimmy Carter died in December 2024 at age 100, and he was buried near the modest ranch house he shared with his wife for more than 6 decades. The simple gray headstone reads, James Earl Carter, Jr., Georgia State Senator, Governor of Georgia, President of the United States, co-founder of the Carter Center. The property is managed by the Park Service and will one day open to the public as another addition to the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. More in a moment. This is Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE. My favorite monument to visit is the Lincoln Memorial because it's really a living site of history. It's not stuck in the past. From, Marian Anderson's famous concert on the steps to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And Warm Springs has been this way too. President John F. Kennedy visited. Joe Biden held a campaign event nearby in 2020.
FDR came looking for a cure. But it was the lessons he learned here that he used to lift a nation. Humility, empathy, courage, optimism. This place represented a way forward, a way of restoration, of resilience, of healing.
Jason, why is this site so resonant to politicians today?
Well, I think that most people look at FDR as the quintessential Democrat.
Jimmy Carter said today, Warm Springs is a place of history.
I know for a fact when President Carter visited, he said that there was no human being, in particular a Democrat, that shouldn't feel inspired and a feeling of awe standing there at the little White House.
Legends always seem to overwhelm the living. So Jimmy Carter runs a risk coming here to this place, so filled with memories of Franklin Roosevelt, still sorrowing for John Kennedy. He does not have the glamour, the charisma of a Kennedy, and we cannot know whether he has the vision of a Roosevelt. But he does have the nomination of their party.
It's easy to understand why, the White House or a state capitol are important sites for political history. Campaigns are launched from State House steps. Presidents address the nation from the Oval Office. But what can presidential homes specifically tell us about these sometimes larger-than-life figures that maybe their offices or official workplaces can't?
I think one of the most beautiful things about Jimmy Carter's boyhood home specifically is that it feels like home when you walk through the doors. And a lot of our visitors can relate to the size of the house. It is not a very large house. It's one story. It honestly smells like my grandmother's house. And so walking in, you can make a personal connection to their homes, and you can look around and see the surroundings and see, oh, this is where he came from. The streets of Plains, Georgia is nothing like the streets of Washington, D.C. And so I think it gives you a little bit more background knowledge to the leader that they were when they were president. And it helps you go, oh, that's why they made that decision, or that's why they chose that particular leadership style. And it starts in the home that they were raised in, or the home that they continue to go back to.
I think you can see the person behind the persona, especially in places like Jennifer was saying in Jimmy Carter's Boyhood Farm or the little White House. It's very small, very meek. We get the same comments. This smells like my grandmother's house. FDR did not want it to be pompous or pretentious. He told the architect, Henry Toombs, that he didn't want a mansion here. He wanted it approachable. And it's covered in ships and Navy type stuff, all kinds of sailing stuff. And FDR had a love of the water. Just shows the inner workings of people away from the office setting. And it also showed that FDR was a human being and not a machine. Sometimes people thought that he was invincible, but in Warm Springs, he could be himself. He didn't have to hide his braces. Everybody that was here were fellow polio patients, and they knew that he had polio and was paralyzed from the waist down as well. So it was the one place he could be himself, and you can see that when you walk in the home.
I want you each to pick an object, a spot on your site, or an anecdote that you just love or that you think tells us a lot about the person or the place.
I'll start. For me, it is the platform of the historic depot in downtown Plains, which is where his presidential campaign headquarters was located. It was chosen as the location of his campaign headquarters because it was the only building that had a public restroom at the time. But when I think about the platform specifically, we have a beautiful photograph in our museum of Miss Lillian Carter, Jimmy Carter's mother, standing on that platform with family, wearing green jerseys with 76 written on the front. And that is the platform that she was standing on when she learned that her son was elected president of the United States. And as a mom, standing on that platform and just thinking about what a moment that must have been, not just for her, but for the whole family. And then he made speeches off of that platform. And fast forwarding to the 1980 campaign, he came back to Plains to cast his vote for the 1980 election, and then made a speech off that platform as his last attempt to rally and to talk to the people that was his community. And so thinking about all that has occurred on that platform, and when you sit on it and you just feel the quietness of the town now, it's just moving, honestly. And so that's a place that whenever I need a moment to refocus or reframe my mind, or just to be inspired, I love walking down to the depot in Plains and standing on that platform and just thinking about all the things that occurred around it.
So for me, this is a pretty easy question. There's no doubt in my mind that the most important place on our site would be the pools. Without those pools, FDR may have never re-entered politics, may have never became president of the United States. The world may look a whole lot different than it does today. And there's a photograph in our museum of FDR and his first swim on October 4th of 1924. And he has the most enormous smile on his face, and it's probably the biggest smile he'd had in 3 years since he contracted polio. He was able to wiggle his toes. First time he'd been able to do that in 3 years. He was able to relax and enjoy himself and get away from the worries of the world around him. No doubt that the pools is probably the most special part of our site. The house is wonderful, it's beautiful, but without those pools, the house wouldn't exist today. And the pools are what brought him here and what kept him here ultimately.
So I've lived in DC before, and when I think about states rich in presidential history, I think about Virginia. You've got Monticello, Mount Vernon, Montpelier. I've been to Lincoln's house in Springfield, Illinois, Benjamin Harrison's in Indianapolis, but I wonder if you both could make the case for me of why Georgia should be right up there with the best of them when it comes to important sites of presidential history?
Warm Springs and the Little White House have a place in presidential history for many reasons, but without FDR's policies that he put into place during the Great Depression, a lot of things that we take for granted might not have come to pass. 40-hour work weeks, Social Security Administration, a lot of things that we use today, the Rural Electrification Act, were born right here at the Little White House, and because of his experiences here in this little rural town. All of our guests that come are so blown away by the fact that he come to this little town and it changed him so drastically, and by doing that, changed world history forever. And I think that's why the Little White House in particular holds a special place in presidential history.
Yeah, bouncing off of that, I think there's a really good case for humanizing the president here in Georgia, not only with Warm Spring and FDR using it as a place to sort of get away and to think and to heal. For President Carter, he obviously had such an attachment to plains that after his presidency, he could have lived anywhere. He could have lived in Atlanta, Georgia, but then chose plains. It's a place that he felt at home and felt most comforted. I think it really helps humanize the presidency, and Georgia helps people just remember that while they are great leaders and they have this weight on their shoulders and challenge after challenge after challenge, at the end of the day, they are still people who need a place to just come and be who they are, away from the national spotlight. And sometimes going into those places of repose helps bring out great national policies.
Jennifer Hopkins is the lead education ranger at Jimmy Carter National Historical Park in Plains, Georgia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Jason Grantham manages Roosevelt's Little White House State Historic Site in Warm Springs, Georgia. Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE. Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave us a rating. You can also now find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10. And remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas. I'll be back next week with my colleague Raul Bally. Safe travels and happy 4th of July.